So our final speaker for the day is San Francisco Chronicle urban design critic John King. In 2016, John ran a series that tackled the regional planning challenges posed by sea level rise, and he'll be helping us tie together today's conversation. So please help me give a warm welcome to Mr. John King.
Okay, I was given the option of doing polling, kind of online polling or whatever, and in retrospect I should have done, do you want to hear me talk or do you want to just take off half an hour early? But I didn't get it set up, so I also want to apologize. I had hoped to catch at least the afternoon piece of this, given that certainly my much more illustrious columnist co-worker Phil Mateer was moderating a panel, which I can only imagine was fun. But I actually ended up having to do a story on the Trans-Bay Joint Power Authority, so a different type of infrastructure. So I'm just got here, but I looked over the agenda and it was a very impressive agenda. It was also, you've digested a lot of information today and kind of very daunting and intricate. So what I wanted to do for the last half hour is pull back a little bit into a bit more of a general way and then leave a little bit of time for questions. But I wanted to pull back, and if we could have the first slide up. It's already up. See, I can't see what I'm looking at. But you can see this, correct? It's over there? Okay. And these two shots, anybody who knows San Francisco Bay, and that's the audience here today, knows that these are equally true representations of San Francisco Bay. One in Fisherman's Wharf looking toward the Golden Gate Bridge, the other one not, but down near the Dumbarton Bridge and kind of the start of the South Bay Salt Ponds heading down on the east. Next slide, please. This is a shot from beautiful Oakland Airport. I did not take this taking off of a plane, thank goodness, but while walking the seawall with the current president of the Planning Coalition. Next image, please. And this is a shot from the bicycle trail heading up to Marina Bay, so kind of north of Berkeley and all. And if you're a real eyeballer of the San Francisco skyline, you can see it's several months out of date. I have all these photographs that looked fine for 4 or 5 years, and now, even if I took them 6 months ago, they're gone because of Salesforce Tower. Next image, please. And this is another shot of the bay, this part, Mission Creek. Next shot, please. And this is a different type of pier, a different type of apron. Instead of the apron along AT&T Park, this is the apron, I believe, along Pier 19, but it might be 25 or 27. It's one of those atmospheric-looking piers that hold parking and very light storage inside because they're not fit for anything more durable than that right now. Next slide. And this is a shot looking toward the bay from Foster City. You're going to have to trust me, there is a bay beyond the levee. And there's also Beachside Park, I think it's called, which hasn't yet made it onto any postcards I know of. Next image. And this is a different sort of levee. This was up in the North Bay near Highway 37, the Sears Point restoration that's been going on. This is from I guess like the fall of 2015 when it was popped. And next image. And this is a similar scene down in the South Bay several years later. This is the South Bay Salt Ponds, one of the restored pieces. It kind of looks like wonderful nature left behind amid all the urbanization, but in fact those are basically created places for birds to nest and rook and whatnot, or whatever you call it. Next image. And this who knows what this is? Any hands going up? This is one of the more interesting wetlands along the bay. This is south of, I believe, Pier 80 in San Francisco, might be Pier 96. And this was basically an asphalt dock that Loma Prieta hit in 1989. It shook, it collapsed. The port was pretty much dead by then down there, so it's not like anything of note happened. It probably didn't even rate a line in any stories the next day. But what's interesting is that wetlands have reclaimed this. Essentially, 25 years later, you've got some odd but pretty promising wetlands that were nature reasserting itself. And I believe the Audubon Society goes down once a month and the port lets them in, and they, pull non-natives and whatnot. But it's essentially a fenced-off area kind of behind the slag heap with the recycled concrete next to the recycling place. It's not the Embarcadero. And the next image, and this is a much different sort of scene, kind of going back to the beginning. Taken the same day, you can catch that by the atmospheric sunlight. You get Fisherman's Wharf, Pier 45, the kind of where the remnants of the wholesale fishing industry are in San Francisco. And then you get a ship that's the embodiment of modern 21st century ports. The big container ship coming in this case from Asia. And I think the last image, one more after, several more after this. This is a pier down near Candlestick Point, which I only point out because you can see how close the water is to it. This was not a particularly high tide day. I just happened to be down there. Next image. This is behind piers 1.5, 3, and 5. Last December during the king tides, and you can see the king tides are asserting themselves. And the next image, and this is basically the same scene, but the water got a little bit higher. And last image. Okay, and then again, the point of all these images, and I certainly don't need to tell you folks this, but I think it's important that we always keep it in our minds. San Francisco Bay is many places. It is many things. It is natural. It is semi-recreated nature. It is intensely urban. It's a strange hybrid of the two. It is not a monoculture or a single environment or anything. It wasn't before the gold rush, and it certainly isn't now. And the fact that it's many different places and many different things means that as we prepare for the future, and this would be true even without the likelihood of sea level rise, but especially so given the projections, we're going to need to think about many types of responses. And looking at some of the panels you had and some of the panelists, I'm sure a lot of these points were touched on, that in terms of dealing with sea level rise and the projected increases, we've got about a 25-year window to really get a lot of the natural restoration going so that it can kind of get rooted and acclimated so that as the tides go up, if the marshes are designed right, which I'll get to in a second, you can see marshes kind of recalibrate themselves, retreat as need be, and so on and so forth. But again, it's a challenge that even whether it's the most extreme projections or the least extreme projections, it is something that we need to get going now, and we need to keep steadily going. With all the other issues in the Bay Area, this needs to be a constant pressing issue, but it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And the fact is, there will need to be gray solutions, there will need to be green solutions. The more restoration of marshes, the better, but you're not going to turn the levee along Foster City into a wetland. You're not going to replace the seawall in San Francisco's Embarcadero with a horizontal levee. I mean, there are places where there will need to be solid constructions. There will need to be places where we really do think, how can we do environmental responses that succeed on a number of fronts? It will mean a lot of experimentation. For those of you who don't read the Chronicle that much, or those of you who do and wonder why the heck I was writing about sea level rise last year, I mean, I'm our urban design critic. I tend to write about buildings and plans and public spaces and things like that. But over the last few years, I got to thinking more and more that this is San Francisco Bay. The thing that defines these 9 counties and all the residents within them is that we share the shoreline of the bay. And if the bay is the thing that defines this metropolitan region, environmental pressures changing the bay will define the future of this region. And so as an urban design writer, I needed to be up to speed on that, and I needed to be thinking about that a lot more, and I needed to be telling readers about this. And you know, I was lucky, and some of the people were on the panels you had today. You know, the Bay Area has no shortage of people who have given this a lot of thought and have really tackled it in a lot of creative ways and are continuing to digest the information, continuing to generate the information. But it was definitely a learning curve. And I think it will be a learning curve for the region as a whole. Because all of you know, and this was alluded to in the video, in the Bay Area, it tends to love process. It tends to love the search for some ill-defined perfection that everyone defines differently, rather than kind of working out a solution that works pretty well and we're going to go forward, and if it doesn't work great, you know, we can just adjust it as it goes along. The Bay Area likes to say, let's map something out so every eventuality is predicted in the start and there will be no surprises. Anyone who has studied the environment and the science of sea level rise knows there has been plenty of surprises connected with it in the last 30 years. It's kind of the massive environmental equivalent of bicycle lanes that weren't in any neighborhood plans or any city plans 20 years ago, and now it's like a driving transportation issue. But as I talked to people last year, it was fascinating that the South Bay salt ponds have learned all these lessons they're applying to the next phases. Went up to the Sears Point restoration, and there was a batch done about 15 or 20 years ago, and it functions really well and it looks beautiful. And it was explained to me all of the calculations that were wrong in it and all the things that had to be done to finally make it start to kind of catch up nature-wise. The new piece, which was done, again, the breach was the fall of 2015, it incorporated all those lessons, and the last time I was out there, they were learning a whole bunch of new lessons. Like one, you know, if the first one didn't have the kind of through flow you needed to really have a good evolving area, that one had too much of a through flow, and all of the little mountains that the tufts of reeds were going to all flourish on were being washed out into the bay. You know, there's going to be a lot of trial and error, there's going to be a lot of experimentation, and we're going to need to accept that. We need to accept there are many different solutions, there will be many mistakes, we need to have many experiments, and we have to understand the idea is to just build toward the conclusion. And the other thing I want to stress is that this work is not just defensive. It is not, oh my God, how are we going to turn back the tides? Maybe we should just build a big dike underneath the Golden Gate Bridge, which does get talked about from time to time. But the fact is, the work that you all are involved in, the work that's being generated right now, and the thought that's being generated, it can truly make for a better Bay Area. And if nothing else, the legacy of the environmental movement as it relates to the Bay in the last 50 years or so shows this. I mean, we have seen the Bayside dumps that now are beautiful waterfront parks. Crissy Field's an obvious example in San Francisco, but you go down the peninsula and, Palo Alto's Shoreline Park, a lot of those areas down there, the kind of cool hill jutting up along the water, that's where the trash was. Similar thing plays out in Berkeley with the Marina Park and all. And then you look at San Francisco. I mean, the recalibrated Embarcadero, it's a work in progress, and it has a lot of challenges ahead in a lot of different ways. The environmental aspect's been fairly minor, but the whole drive to take down the Embarcadero Freeway was part of this larger thought of the Bay is us. We should not separate ourselves from the Bay with dumps and freeways and everything. We should try to connect to the Bay. And a simple thing like an earthquake set a chain in motion at the Embarcadero that is probably the first destination for visitors to San Francisco. Certainly visitors to San Francisco who are too cool to go take the cable car first. They want to be at the ferry building. They want to walk the Embarcadero, things like that. So you see this top to bottom, the ecological restorations that are going on with something like the South Bay salt ponds. All of these things are making for a better area. And I think that's a real challenge in the future for all of us, wherever we're coming from, is to realize all the expense, all the mental exertion, all the political fights, they can take us in the right direction, and they can make this into a more attractive region, a more compelling region, and a more economically prosperous region. Just to briefly jump away from the Bay, something that'll sound obvious now, any of you who, and I'm sure you all do, any of you who know travelers who come into the Bay Area for a few days and they're coming from the East Coast or they're coming from the Sun Belt or whatever, and they're here for pleasure, not just business, they probably want to go up to the wine country. They want to go up to Napa. The cool ones want to go up to Sonoma. The really cool ones drive through Sonoma on their way to Anderson Valley. It wasn't a given that those places would exist the way that they do. If you go back into the 60s and 70s, there were big fights in Napa about, do you preserve Napa Valley primarily as an agricultural area, primarily for grapes, or do you just kind of keep Vallejo rolling north and things like that? At this point, it's just kind of trivia at the back of the newspaper morgue for history majors like me to come across. But that wasn't a given at all. It wasn't a given that the San Mateo coastline would remain the way it has. All of these things that are now part of the selling point for the Bay Area, the things that are disruptive economically because they make the area so desirable, are in fact the end result of major environmental battles that at the time were seen as not necessarily good business and not necessarily smart regional growth. But the thing is, if we think about how do we make this region livable and attractive and varied, it will pay off for all of us. So just to kind of wrap up on this, I talked about how we're going to need many responses in terms of the systemic responses, whether it's the engineering, whether it's the environmental issues, whether it's the balancing of development and open space. But it also will be necessary for all sides to give a little bit. And that's particularly hard in the Bay Area because the Bay Area loves simplistic, self-righteous political posturing. And you know, you're laughing because you've seen it all in action. Certainly it plays out on the waterfront. Certainly it plays out on issues like Bay Fill and all. It's been interesting seeing the BCDC over the last decade or so kind of shift into the whole thinking about, okay, we were created to save the Bay. Well, the Bay's not going to get any, the Bay now is going to take care of itself and grow. We've got to think about how to keep the growth from not lapping up Market Street and washing away Jack London Pier and making San Francisco Airport shift over to those cool old airplanes you saw in World War II that could take off, you know, from the Pacific Ocean. You know, so it will mean that environmentalists will need to recognize that we're going to give and we're going to get. And maybe we will allow land, you know, again, Foster City, I wrote about that as in one of the stories I did last year, and I heard from people who, no, there are these horizontal levees, we could do this and everything. And it might or might not be scientifically valid. It would be an extreme reach in the real world to do something like that. And I don't just mean that as a, well, let's not get carried away, but just the topography of the Bay down there is a much different thing than it is in areas where you're looking at having these horizontal levees, like up in the North Bay. Theoretically, it will mean that regulators will have to give a little bit, and this is where a lot of, this is where, again, between the Bay Area being so perfectionist and a lot of very right-minded people pursuing their passion in life, it will mean realizing, and this is the kind of thing the Bay Planning Coalition advocates for all the time, there are ways to do dredging that might not satisfy the Army Corps 100%, but overall they can pay off a lot more. There might be Bay access issues that make a BCDC project manager kind of pull his or her shoulders back at first, but it makes sense in these other ways. You know, there are one of the things that really struck me last year is somehow there needs to be something in the Bay Area so that all these huge projects can get vetted earlier, quicker, by a larger group of eyes to kind of keep them moving, because that's been one of the real challenges. Every time I write a heartening story about a Bay Area restoration project, or in a different field, a Bay Area affordable housing project, you know, you always find out that it started 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and 19 public agencies had to sign off on it, and there are 8 different public funding sources, and the journalists just show up for opening day and they say, why isn't there more like this? This is how the world should be. And we're right, that is how the world should be, but obviously it's only going to get there by people realizing the implacable nature of sea level rise does change the equation. The Bay Area is lucky in a lot of ways. We have the resources and we have a topography that kind of saves us from some of the more short-term effects, but it does change the equation. But also, as I was mentioning, it's also business changing. I can imagine any developer working near the water, along the water, if the question is, how do I prepare for sea level rise? You know that developer or someone working for them is going to say, well, but the low end of the projection is only this, and we're not mandated to do that. And the fact is, if you just go there first, you're probably going to save yourself time in lawsuits and in changing standards and in nervous insurance companies, and it also lets you plan it out. It's fascinating looking at the plans for Treasure Island, how there's this 300-foot deep Bayside Park facing San Francisco. And me being a good urban kind of guy, to me it's like, geez, 300 feet of wasted green space. You know, you could have the buildings right over here and you could just, you know, have a glass of champagne in the waterfront restaurant and then throw the champagne glass into the water. But of course, if the more extreme projections are correct, you've got a 300-foot buffer zone to work with in 2100 or 2090 or 2120. You know, so it's just, it's kind of, everyone needs to take a deep breath, I think, and just say, this region has flourished because it cares about being a rare combination of nature and city. And the more that we pursue that, and the more imaginative we are, and the more adventurous we are, we can make progress toward that. And it will continue to be a bay that is many different places. It will be a bay that will have new attractions, whether it's bird watching or bicycle trails or new buildings in at Pier 70 or places like that. The real potential is there, and so the question is, can we set those things in motion in the next 10 years or so, given all the other issues in the world? You know, taking Washington out of the equation, as hard as it is to do for anyone who follows social media. Even if you take Washington out of the equation, homelessness is an issue, transportation is an issue, housing prices are an issue. But this is the issue that will just continue, and it will continue to be more and more urgent and visible. And that's why I'm flattered to be asked to talk to all of you, since you know a lot more than I do, and also since you're all in a rare position to work, whether it's behind the scenes or at the meetings, to keep nudging us in that direction. So I just want to wrap up the comments there. I started a few minutes early, so I'll end a few minutes early. And if anyone has questions, I would love to take them. And if not, we will all leave early. Okay.